Hello, my name's Chapman, and what we're here to talk about today is the importance of using a risk assessment. So we'll start today's podcast with how risk assessments can be used to prevent harm and the relevant legislation for why they must be carried out. We will look into what should be included in a risk assessment and who is responsible for carrying them out. We'll provide an overview of the HSE management standards, including how to identify risk factors for a risk assessment, how to identify who can be harmed and how to evaluate your risk, how to record your findings, and how to monitor and review the assessment. Finally, we'll discuss a little bit about BSG, who we are, and about our risk assessment software. An intrinsic part of managing the health and safety of your business is controlling the risks in your workplace. And to do this, you need to think about what can cause harm to people and decide whether you are taking reasonable steps to prevent that harm. This is known as a risk assessment and is something you are required by law to carry out. So what is a risk assessment? Risk assessments comprise the identification of hazards, the evaluation of the associated risks, and the determination of appropriate control measures. Many activities on a construction site are hazardous by nature, and all activities require a full assessment of the risk. The relevant legislation includes the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974, the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. The approved Code of Practice L21 was withdrawn in July 2013 and replaced by the INDG 163, Risk Assessment, a Brief Guide to Controlling the Risks in the Workplace. Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act deals with the general duties of employers to their employees, and it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees, and to provide systems of work that are, so far as is reasonably practicable, safe and without risks to health, ensuring, so far as is reasonably practicable, the safety and absence of risks to health in connection with the use of articles and substances, the provision of such information, instruction, training and supervision as is necessary to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety at work of his employees. Regulation 3 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 require employers to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of his employees to which they are exposed whilst they are at work, and the risks of health and safety of persons not in his employment arising out of or in connection with the conduct by him of his undertaking. Regulation 3 also says that any such assessment shall be reviewed by the employer if there is a reason to suspect that it is no longer valid or there has been a significant change in the matters to which it relates, and where as a result of any such review changes to an assessment are required, the employer concerned shall make them. And it further states, an employer shall not employ a young person unless he has made or reviewed an assessment in relation to the risks of the health and safety of the young persons. And in making or reviewing the assessment, the employer shall take particular account of the inexperience, lack of awareness of risks and immaturity of young persons, the range and use of work equipment and the way in which it is handled, the organisation of processes and activities, the extent of the health and safety training provided or to be provided to the young person. And where the employer employs 5 or more employees, he shall record the significant findings of the assessment and any group of his employees identified by it as being especially at risk. A risk assessment isn't about creating huge amounts of paperwork, but rather about identifying sensible measures to control the risks in your workplace. There are probably already things in place to protect your employees, but a risk assessment will help you decide whether you have covered everything you need to. What must be included in an assessment? Your risk assessment should include consideration of what in your business might cause harm and how and the people it may be affected. It should take into account any controls which are already in place and identify what, if any, further controls are required. You should be able to show from your assessment that a proper check was made, all the people who may be affected were considered, all significant risks have been assessed, and the precautions you've taken are reasonable, and the remaining risk has been minimised so far as is reasonably practicable. You don't need to include insignificant risks. You do not need to include risks from everyday life unless your work activities increase the risk. Who's responsible for carrying out the risk assessment? Well, as an employer or self-employed person, you're responsible for the health and safety in your business. You can delegate the task of risk assessment, but ultimately you are responsible. You will need to make sure that whoever does the risk assessment is competent to do so, involves your workers in the process, and understands when specialist help might be needed. In certain circumstances, it may be necessary to call in specialists to carry out the risk assessment, for instance when working with asbestos or when a noise assessment is required. It should be a team exercise involving a cross-section of skills and experience to ensure that all aspects of the work are considered. It's quite possible for a risk assessment that was prepared for another project to be used again. Many tasks are repeated and the contractor should already have in place suitable procedures to deal with common situations. However, the existence of a risk assessment must not lead to a sense of complacency. In the construction industry, each project is individual because the site and the working conditions will change. Think about how accidents and ill health could happen and concentrate on the real risks, those that are most likely and which will cause the most harm. Consult and involve the workforce. The HSE stresses that formal consultation is not required before every task-specific assessment conducted in workplaces. However, whenever possible, employees and staff representatives should be involved in the risk assessment process. Your employees know firsthand what the risks in the workplace are. They can probably offer practical solutions to controlling them. Staff engagement throughout the risk assessment process can also make the implementation of any control measures easier. The Health and Safety Executive publication, Risk Assessment, A Brief Guide to Controlling the Risks in the Workplace, outlines 5 main steps that a risk assessment should follow. They include: identify the risk factors, decide who might be harmed and how, evaluate the risk and decide on any action, record your findings, and monitor and review your findings. So step 1, identify the hazards. One of the most important aspects of a risk assessment is accurately identifying the potential hazards in the workplace. Start with the physical properties of the workplace and identify those hazards. Consider what activities, processes or substances used could injure your employees or harm their health. There are some hazards with a recognised risk of harm, for example working at height, working with certain chemicals, machinery and asbestos. Depending on the type of work you do, there may be other risks that are relevant to your business. Checking manufacturers' instructions or data sheets for chemicals and equipment can be helpful when explaining the hazards and putting them in their true perspective. Look back at your accident and ill health records, as these can help identify less obvious hazards. Remember to think about the long-term hazards to health, for instance high levels of noise or exposure to harmful substances. An example of typical hazards on a construction site include slips and trips. 1/3 of all serious injuries result from slipping on a level surface. Working at height. 1/4 of all fatalities result from falls over 2 meters. Vehicles. Hazards from vehicles can come from vehicles used in-house and on public roads for business, even if these vehicles are privately owned. And vibration. Both whole body vibration and hand-on vibration should be considered as hazards in the workplace. Noise. If a normal conversation cannot be carried out in a workplace, it is likely that the noise is around 85 decibels or above, which means further investigation of noise levels should take place. So step 2, who might be harmed? Think how employees or others who may be present, such as contractors or visitors, could be harmed. It needs to be clear who might be harmed by each hazard, which will also help you identify the best way of controlling the risk. That doesn't mean listing everyone by name, but rather identifying groups of people. Examples can include security staff, managers, supervisors, clients, designers, construction workers, principal contractors, visitors, and the general public. Think about people who might not be in the workplace all the time, such as visitors, contractors, and maintenance workers. Take members of the public into account if they may be affected by the site activities. Ask the workforce, is there anyone else who should be included? Some vulnerable workers may have particular requirements, such as new and young workers, migrant workers, nursing mothers or expectant mothers, people with disabilities, temporary workers and lone workers. Additional controls may be required to reduce the risk to an acceptable level for these employees. Step 3. Evaluate the risk. The hazards having been identified, the likelihood of them causing harm must be evaluated. Risk is a part of everyday life and not all risks can be eliminated. What you must do is make sure that the risks are known and what has been done to manage them responsibly has been identified. If the risk assessment identifies a number of hazards, they need to be put in order of importance and address the most serious risks first. Identify long-term solutions for the risks with the biggest consequences, as well as those risks most likely to cause accidents or ill health. It should also be established whether there are improvements that can be implemented quickly, even temporarily, until more reliable controls can be put in place. Remember, the greater the hazard, the more robust and reliable the measures to control the risk of injury occurring will need to be. When evaluating the risk, assessment should take into account likelihood, the chance of harm occurring, frequency, how often the risk of harm occurs during the process or activity being assessed, duration, the length of time that the likelihood of harm exists, severity, the likely severity of the harm should it occur. To calculate an assessment of risk, the following equation is often used. Risk equals likelihood times severity. This means that the risk is a combination of how likely it is that someone may be injured and the severity of the injury likely to be sustained. A qualitative system will use words to describe likelihood and severity, such as, for likelihood it's almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely and rare. And for the severity, severe, major, moderate, minor, insignificant. The risk assessment matrix shows the numerical value of the risk evaluation. And across the top we have the severity of the injury should it occur. We range from insignificant in the low numbers to severe up in the high numbers, and from rare in the low numbers and almost certain in the high numbers for the likelihood of that harm occurring. When the risks are very low, they are considered acceptable and no further action is necessary other than to ensure that the control measures in place are maintained. When the risk is low, no additional control measures are required unless they can be implemented at a fairly low cost in terms of time, money and effort. Actions to further reduce these risks are assigned a fairly low priority and arrangements should be made to ensure that the control measures stay in place. When a risk is medium, consideration should be given as to whether the risk can be lowered, where applicable, to a tolerable level and preferably to an acceptable level. But the costs of additional risk reduction measures should be taken into account. The risk reduction measures should be implemented within a defined time period. Arrangements should be made to ensure that once the control measures are in place, they are maintained, particularly if the risk levels are associated with harmful consequence. Substantial efforts should be made to reduce the risks when they are high. Risk reduction measures should be implemented urgently within a defined time period, and it may be necessary to consider suspending or restricting the activity or to apply interim risk control measures until this has been completed. Considerable resources may have to be allocated to additional controls. An arrangement should be made to make sure that the controls, once in place, are maintained, particularly if the risk levels are associated with extremely harmful consequences and very harmful consequences. Risks that are very high are unacceptable. Substantial improvements in risk controls are necessary so that the risk is reduced to an acceptable level. The work activity should be halted until risk controls are implemented that reduce the risk so that it is no longer very high. If it is not possible to reduce the risk, the work should remain prohibited. Risk should be reduced to the lowest reasonably practicable level by taking preventative measures in order of priority. This is what is meant by a hierarchy of control. The list shown sets out the order to follow when planning to reduce risks you have identified in your workplace, and consider the headings in the order shown. Do not simply jump to the easiest control measure to implement. Elimination. Redesign the job or substitute a substance so that the hazard is removed or eliminated. Substitution. Replace the material or process with a less hazardous one. Engineering controls. For example, use work equipment or other measures to prevent falls where you cannot avoid working at height. Install or use additional machinery to control risks from dust or fumes, or separate the hazard from operators by methods such as enclosing or guarding dangerous items of machinery and equipment. Give priority to measures which protect collectively over individual measures. Administrative controls. These are all about identifying and implementing the procedures you need to work safely. For example, reducing the time workers are exposed to hazards, for instance by job rotation, prohibiting the use of mobile phones in hazardous areas, increasing safety signage, and performing the risk assessments. Personal protective clothes and equipment. Only after all the previous measures have been tried and found ineffective in controlling the risk to a reasonably practicable level, must personal protective equipment, PPE, be used. For example, where you cannot eliminate the risk of a fall, the use of work equipment or other measures to minimise the distance and consequences of a fall, should one occur, should be chosen. And if chosen, PPE should be selected and fitted by the person who uses it, and workers must be trained in the function and limitations of each item of PPE. Generally, everything reasonably practicable to protect people from harm must be done. This means balancing the level of risk against the measures needed to control the real risk in terms of money, time or trouble. However, there is no need to take action if it would be grossly disproportionate to the level of risk. A risk assessment should only include what can reasonably be expected. They are not expected to anticipate unforeseeable risks. Look at the control measures already in place. Can the hazard be eliminated altogether? If not, how can the likelihood be reduced so that harm is unlikely? Take practical steps, including a less risky option, preventing access to the hazard, organising your work to reduce exposure to the hazard, issuing protective equipment, providing welfare facilities such as first aid and washing facilities, and involving and consulting the workforce. Risk control is the process of designing, implementing and maintaining measures which reduce a particular risk. Most risk control measures tend to adopt one or more of the following: hazard reduction methods, eliminating the hazard, substituting it for something less hazardous, or redesigning a process, etc. Separation methods, height, distance and remote locations, for instance. Physical barrier methods, placing barriers, fences or guards around the hazard, around the person or around the location. Exposure limitation methods, reducing the number of people exposed to the hazard or the time individuals are exposed to it. Step 4. Record your significant findings. If a company employs fewer than 5 employees, there is no requirement to write anything down, but it may be useful to make a record as it can be reviewed at a later date, for example if something changes. If a company employs 5 or more employees, it is a legal requirement that the assessment is recorded. Any assessment produced should help to communicate and manage the risks in the business. For most, this does not need to be a big exercise, just a note of the significant risks and what control measures have been put in place to manage that risk. And step 5, regularly review your risk assessment. Construction sites by their very nature do not stay the same, so it makes sense to review what's being done on an ongoing basis. Look at the risk assessments again and review. Have there been any significant changes? Are there still improvements that could be made? Has the workforce identified another problem? And have lessons been learned from any accidents or near misses? BSG members can log into the BSG system where they can access over 70 different types of risk assessment templates. Each template is pre-configured with its own set of unique control measures relevant to the task being assessed, and users may simply have to apply a risk rating for each task appraised using our 5x5 risk evaluation matrix. The matrix will automatically calculate scores accordingly based on risk, severity and likelihood. Users can then apply a residual risk rating once the control measures have been considered. After an assessment has been completed, it can be saved as a PDF before being emailed to the site location where the construction work is taking place. So a little bit about who we are. The Building Safety Group was established in 1965 and we're the largest construction safety group operating throughout mainland UK. We are a not-for-profit organisation that is owned by our members for the benefit of our members, and we're recognised by the HSE. We currently have an impressive 800 member companies, with our team of highly qualified safety advisors delivering over 20,000 site inspections every year, and over 10,000 people attend our training courses every year, which are also held across the UK. That concludes today's podcast. I hope you found it helpful and informative, and we will be producing more of them very soon.